Hey guys, how's it going? So in this lesson today, we are going to be talking about environmental chemistry, okay? So now this stuff is totally new. You'd never learned it in any chemistry class that you've ever taken in high school ever before, right? And so environmental chemistry has to do with what are the effects of what we do? What are the effects of the chemicals that we release on the environment around us, right? So it's pretty timely, right? Like this course is great because it's the only course that kind of deals with what we're doing to the environment and how our effects are changing. And a lot of it has to do with chemistry and acids and things that we've already talked about. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of a background, right? Because what you have to know is, where does our energy come from? Okay, well, our energy comes from like coal and oil, right? And natural gas, right? This is a piece of coal, and oil, which is the liquid, right? Coal is a solid, and of course natural gas, which you burn in your home and it heats up your home. And these things are what we are using to fuel our homes, right? Now, why do people think this is bad? Okay, well, we gotta go back in time, right? To like 365 million years ago or whenever, when there were dinosaurs and plants, and Alberta was actually like pretty lush, right? We had lots of forests, we had like lots of animals, right? And they were like grazing, we had dinosaurs. I don't even know what it is, a dinosaur, right? Anyways, so these things were in Alberta about 365 million years ago, and of course these things died. And when they died, right, all of these things died. All of these things, right, were now in the soil, right? So you're going to get dead plants in the soil. You're going to get dead animals in the soil. All of these things were in the soil. And now these dead plants and these dead animals, right, became like coal. Now, how did they do that? Well, when the soil like pushed layers and layers and layers above these dead animals, they started to compress and they started to squeeze together. And when they squeeze together, right, over time, millions of years, in fact, this takes millions of years, it becomes this like coal. Okay, now what does coal actually contain? Well, remember, coal was something that was alive at one time, right? So this dead plant becomes coal. What did these living things, what were they made up of? Well, these living things are made up of DNA, right? Well, DNA and like nitrogen is in that DNA, right? And when they're dead, that coal maybe still contains some nitrogen in that DNA, still has it inside of it, right? Not only that, there's proteins that were in, right? We know we're alive. We know we have DNA. We know we need protein. That's how we build muscles. Well, guess what? Proteins have sulfur and also nitrogen in them as well. And so we can assume that this dead plant also maybe has some of that sulfur that it had when it was alive is still contained in its dead remnant self, right? There it is. It's dead self. Well, we also know like these plants and animals, right? These guys had sugar, right? Like C6, this is glucose, right? And that this is food, right? And so we know that these guys had food, and that food is stored in the body like carbon, right? So this is glucose, which is sugar, which you learned in Science 10, right? And this sugar is stored in our bodies. Well, we can assume that some of that carbon is still probably in our dead self. So now here we've made coal, and that coal that we have still maybe contains nitrogen and sulfur and carbon from when we were alive, right? And now this coal, right, is now us when we're dead, and we contain stored chemical energy. Stored chemical potential energy. Okay, so what does that mean when we have stored chemical potential energy? Okay, let me just write that a little bit better so that everybody can see. This piece of coal, and coal comes from dead plants, okay? Animals, dead marine animals make oil, right? So dead plants make coal, right? Dead marine animals make oil and natural gas. So that's why when you see rigs in the ocean and they're trying to dig for oil in the oceans, and even here in Alberta, the oil that we have came from marine organisms. Hi, baby. Sorry about that. Okay, anyways, So that is where coal comes from. All right. Now, coal comes from dead plants. Oil, natural gas. Oil and natural gas comes from dead, like marine or like ocean life, right? Even in the deserts of Saudi Arabia, where they have so much oil, that used to be water. And there's so much of that dead marine life in those deserts. Anyways, so what was I talking about? Oh yeah. So basically, coal contains stored chemical potential energy. Okay, so what is stored chemical potential energy? Well, potential energy is energy that's stored. That's what potential means. So you and I have stored potential energy in ourselves when we eat food and we store it, right? And we use it for later. It's chemical because this potential energy that's stored is found in chemical bonds, right? Like in the DNA, in the protein, in the sugar, right? It's stored in these chemical bonds. That's where the energy is stored. And so what happens is when we burn this coal or oil or natural gas, so let's say here's our piece of coal. We know that this piece of coal still has like nitrogen in it from when it was alive. It has sulfur in it. There's like carbon in that piece of coal, right? When we burn it with fire, when we burn it, well, guess what? This is released into the air. Okay, and so what you're going to have happen is you're going to start seeing this nitrogen released into the air. You're going to start to see this sulfur released into this air. And sulfur is found naturally as S8. And you're going to start to see carbon released into the air. So all of these things are now being released into the air. And what is this carbon going to do? It's going to react with oxygen. And it's going to form CO2. And that's our greenhouse gas that is warming up the earth right now. Right? And that's because that coal contained it. It's released. Imagine all the dead things on Earth that we're taking out of the soil, we're taking out of the oceans, and then we're burning it. Imagine how much carbon we're emitting into the air that should have stayed in the ground, that belonged in the ground, but now it's being released into the air, causing this greenhouse gas, causing the Earth to heat up. Right? That's what's happening. But this N2 and S8, well, guess what? They also react with oxygen to form like these SO3. Well, we're going to call it SOx. SOX. This X just means it can be, this SOX just means it can be SO2 or SO3, right? So this X just indicates the O can have 2 or 3, but I just give it X because I don't know if it's 2 or 3. So I call it SOx, right? So that indicates it could be either SO2 or SO3 that's being released when sulfur reacts with oxygen. And guess what? N2 also reacts with oxygen, and N2 and O2 produce these NOx, NOx, because NOx can also refer to like NO2 and NO3. Those are both produced when nitrogen reacts with oxygen, right? So we produce, when we burn coal, SOx, NOx, and carbon dioxide. Okay. Now, carbon dioxide, we already talked a little bit about. It heats up the earth, but this NOx and SOx does something different to the earth, and we're going to talk about that because you need to know it. It causes what we say acid deposition. Okay, so it causes acid deposition. Okay, now acid deposition can either be dry deposition or wet deposition. Okay, so it talks about that. What is dry deposition? Dry deposition just means it's like solid, right? It's solid in air, right? And so like, it's like, I don't know, dust or dirt, those are solid and you breathe those in, that's dry deposition, right? Whereas wet deposition refers to, it's in like rain, right? We're talking about, we find it in rain, sleet, hail, snow. That's wet deposition. So you can see it's like not solid in air. It's coming down as a liquid. Okay. Also, it talks about the difference between particulates. Well, a particulate versus gaseous emissions. Okay, you need to know what a particulate is. A particulate, again, is solid, like dry deposition. And gaseous emissions is like, of course, CO2, which is a gas, which is causing our Earth to heat up. right? They also refer to that NOx and SOx. These are gaseous emissions, right? So remember, things can exist as a solid, a liquid, or a gas, right? So particulates represent solids, like in the air, like we just talked about when we talked about dry deposition. Those are particulates, right? If you're asthmatic and you breathe in this dry deposition, right, which is like the dry stuff in the air, then it's going to affect your asthma, right? Liquid deposition is this wet deposition, which is like acid rain, right? Acid rain is an example of wet deposition, where you find the acid in rain or sleet or hail or snow. And then gaseous emissions is gas, right? So you either solid, liquid, gas, right? That's how these chemicals are emitted. They're emitted as solids, which you can breathe in. They're emitted as liquids, like acid rain, right? Acid rain has chemicals in it. Or they can be as gases, right? Like CO2, which is causing our air to, to heat up, our earth to heat up. So that's those things. We're going to talk about acid deposition primarily today. This is called wet deposition, right? We're going to talk about that because this wet deposition is something that you need to know for your Science 30. It's part of your outcome. So basically, let's just talk about it. We talked about how N2 plus O2 gives you this NOx. Well, guess what? This is a gaseous emission, okay? This is a gaseous emission, but this that you produce, this gas you can produce, this NOx, can also react with water in the air, right? Water, because like cloud stuff, rain. So this is a liquid, right? And that can produce HNO3. And that is an acid. And that is acid deposition. It's when this gaseous emission, this gas emission, reacts with the water in our air and produce acid deposition, or you guys know it as acid rain, right? So remember, where did this N2 come from? It came from burning coal or burning oil or burning gas, right? Like that's where this is coming from. And this is causing this excess NOx in the air, which is a gas, that reacts with water, and that forms this acid rain that comes down. So you can't stick your tongue out in the rain and drink that rain because you don't know if it's acid and it's going to burn your tongue, right? The same applies with when you release S8, right? When you burn the coal and you release the S8 into the air, well, that also reacts with oxygen and that produces our SOx, right? That's what it makes. Well, guess what? This SOx also reacts with water, right? And so remember, this SOx is a gas emission. So this gas emission can also react with a liquid, water, and guess what it can make? H2SO4, which is an acid, right? And this again forms acid deposition, and this again can be very, very harmful, especially if it falls in a lake where it alters the pH, or it falls in soil and it alters the pH, right? You're going to get this acid deposition. So not only do we release carbon when we burn coal and we create this greenhouse effect with carbon dioxide, we're also creating this acid rain because we are releasing this SOx and NOx and we're creating this acid deposition. It's wreaking havoc, right? In Italy, they had statues that were corroding because of all the acid that was destroying their statues in Italy, right? So that's what the rest of this is about. And the rest of your PowerPoint, you guys take a look at Schoology, or you can look at Google Classroom to fill in the rest of your notes, right? So what I did is I covered where does our oil come from? Well, we talked about how it's dead things that are buried over time. And we talked about sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxides and how we form acid deposition. We also talked about this last part here is about you don't really need to know nutrient availability and pH in the soil, but this talks about limestone. So limestone rock is actually basic rock in Alberta, and if you have all this acid rain, right, and it's falling into a lake, right, and the lake has too much H positive in it because there's all this acid falling into it, well, guess what? If you have this H positive in this lake, then you can neutralize it with limestone rock. That's what you can do because limestone rock is a base. Okay, so these are just things, this is just telling you that limestone rock is used to neutralize, but you can't use granite because granite is not basic. Granite is another type of rock. And then you definitely need to know this last part here, which talks about technologies that try to reduce our emissions. So the electrostatic precipitator is basically when you have all this sulfur being emitted, it gets attracted to this electrostatic precipitator. And it sort of clings onto it, like imagine it clinging onto it, so none of it is actually released into the air. So these are just technologies used to reduce emissions. Scrubbers is another technology that is used to trap sulfur so it doesn't get released. Catalytic converters are found in the car. This reduces nitrogen emissions because what happens is when you guys burn gasoline, you release NOx, NOx, and so catalytic converters are in your car. And so what catalytic converters do is like they take that NOx, that harmful NOx, and it makes it into N2 and O2, and these guys are harmless. Okay, these guys are harmless to our air, so that's what catalytic converters do. So they make these NOx, and they're found in your car, okay, and they're trying to clean out the gasoline. And then liming, okay, we talked about how lime actually neutralizes acid, like in a lake, limestone rock. So if a lake becomes too acidic, neutralize it with limestone rock. So these are technologies that you guys kind of gotta know in order to figure out ways that we're trying to reduce our own impact on the environment. Okay, anyways, I hope that helps. That is actually it for this week with these two lessons. You guys are going to be doing practice problems on 37 and 38, and then you guys are going to do a review at the back here on page 40 to 42 in your booklets. Okay, and it's a short week, so not as much, and that's it for today. Okay, bye.